right now. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Caleb Talley, and I am the Executive Director of Startup Junkie Foundation. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Startup Junkies, we are a mission-driven organization based in Northwest Arkansas, in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and we exist to serve innovators and entrepreneurs through no-cost consulting and events. And so those events can range from lunch and learns, networking events, workshops, webinars just like this one. And our consulting, we meet with entrepreneurs anywhere from idea stage up to $25 million in revenue. And we do that through third-party grants that we've been awarded to help entrepreneurs, innovators to expand on their solutions. We're excited to have you here today as part of this workshop, a webinar on social innovation. And I'm excited to introduce you to, for those that have not met her, Sandra. She's going to be giving us a presentation. Sandra has over a decade of experience in corporate innovation, has deep understanding of how to identify breakthrough ideas, experiment rapidly, and take unique solutions to market. She has invested her time in helping organizations become proactive to overcome future threats rather than being disrupted by them. She's going to take the lead on this webinar. I'm going to pass the baton over to her in just a second, but I was going to make a note that if you have a question at any point during this webinar, feel free to drop it in the chat rather than speaking it out loud. We will have a moment at the end of the presentation where we allow you to ask your question out loud. But if you think you might forget them, go ahead and drop it in the chat, and then I will make note of them and we will address them at the end. So without further ado, Sandra, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. So I just want to make sure that everybody can see what I'm sharing here. Are we good to go? Okay, awesome. So thanks for the introduction, Caleb. It's awesome kind of collaborating with Startup Junkies again. Definitely an entity that is near and dear to me, especially within the entrepreneurship and social innovation space. So it's great to be here. Today, I will be talking to you guys a little bit about some practical tools around, creating space for social innovation. We'll get into some models as well that support social innovation in various organizations. Oh my gosh, my technology is not working here. Here we go. So this is a bit of a roadmap. So we'll start with a definition and an introduction to social innovation. We'll get into sort of the impetus, the problems that we're trying to solve when we start leveraging social innovation tools and social innovation models. And then we'll look at how bringing various players, industries, actors in all of the areas that we work in, public, private, philanthropic, non-for-profit industry, how bringing everybody together can create this collaborative or shared economy, which is gaining lots of popularity, and how we can use that to sort of think differently about the problems we're trying to solve. We'll get into the typical stages of what a social innovation cycle is. We'll look at some, sort of those models at the macro level, and then we'll look at some practical tools there as well. And then we'll end with some questions that I think are really great to ask ourselves whenever we're about to put pen to paper and think about how to create capacity and a framework to support social innovation in our organizations. So with that, just a little bit about myself. So I have spent, over a decade working and creating impact within our communities and looking at how to create capacity and bring various partners and stakeholders around the table to look at redefining the way that we try to solve for problems. So that could involve product or process innovation, which I've worked on for a few years, or my ultimate passion, which is social innovation in the public and non-for-profit sectors. So I've spent a lot of time looking at what this entails, and it's been extremely rewarding. So I'm happy to talk to you about this. So without further ado, I know there's quite a few of you here that are already in the social innovation space and have worked to create impact in social innovation. But for those of us that don't know much about it, it's a really, really interesting way to sort of tackle social problems. So it looks at leveraging atypical tools and bringing various players around the table to fill in some need. And that need could result in a new service model. It could be a new approach. It could be a new initiative. It could really be a new product if you're an industry. So this is really important because we know that nearly all innovation policy that exists out there currently is tailored to meet the needs of the for-profit sector in science and technology, which is really, I think, obvious, but also a missed opportunity as well, because it doesn't factor in the social aspect of things. I also think that meeting economic and social challenges of the next decade will require fundamental improvements in the public service and the way that we look at overcoming problems, large policy problems that we face that we'll talk about in a couple of slides from now. And I think that social innovation is really integral to this movement. And I think that it creates a lot of opportunities for us to move the needle in a positive direction. And you'll see with this quote, it's a really interesting one provided last year by the Young Foundation out of Ontario. They say that innovation is social innovation and product innovation, doesn't matter, but innovation is often a response to underperformance, they say, whether it's within some sort of economic dislocation, right? Some misalignment in the economy, or a declining industry, or an external pressure that exists within a failing service. This is relevant when we look at the community and government as well, right? Like external pressure of a potential failing service. So I think that that's scary too, but also an interesting way to look at where social innovation can play a part in helping us overcome or avoid those failures. So I just wanted to mention that because I always love this quote. It really puts things into context. Oh my gosh, come on. Okay. My slide is just taking a while here. Here we go. So, you know, we talked a little bit about challenges that we're trying to overcome with social innovation, but these are a couple of things that are happening in the world right now that I think really help us understand why there's such an overabundance of focus on social innovation. So these are a couple that I've definitely felt in my line of work. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but we know that certainly in Canada, and there's a lot of you on the call today from Canada, there's this real struggle towards affordable housing right now. So I'm currently employed in Atlantic, Canada on the East Coast, and we see a really, really big challenge with folks trying to access affordable housing because there's such a great need for that right now. And there's been a lot of foreign investment and a lot of increase in the cost of living that are really rendering it extremely challenging for people to access affordable housing, whether it's apartments or home ownership. We know that there is a rising cost of food prices, rising cost of living generally. A lot of that started with the pandemic, and it's certainly been intensified with the recent geopolitical sort of complexity and a lot of the global conflict that we see abroad that's certainly affecting us and really making this a little bit harder for people. We know that the global pandemics redefined the way that we live our lives and the way that we work. And I think a lot of companies have done an awesome job in pivoting as a result of the global pandemic. They figured out a way of strengthening how they respond to their customers' needs, figuring out alternate ways of delivering social services. But I think there's still definitely a gap that we see across the board that's been caused by the pandemic that we haven't quite figured out how to overcome in a unified way. And then, as I said, the political unrest, so the conflict that we see in Russia and Ukraine right now, and I see a few of you have some good backgrounds right now on your Zoom with the Ukrainian flag, supporting Ukraine with everything that's going on. So it's nice to see that. But a lot of that unrest and a lot of those countries have been exporters of tangible goods and services and natural resources that we benefit from here in North America. So it's not like this conflict is separate from us. It does affect us, and it does create a social gap for us. And it does force us to look at how we can fill in that gap and who is responsible for filling that gap in. Is it government? Is it the non-for-profit sector? Is it individual actors? Is it all of the above? So I think that these are all really good examples and reasons that have lit a fire under our feet to explain why there's been such an over-reliance and focus on social innovation in the last few years. So really quickly, I'm going to show you a video. I think that, you know, when we look about capacity building in the community and getting all the right players around the table to help us solve wicked problems, we start to look at co-creation, and we start to look at this circular economy. And I think that it has a really, really good way of rendering or helping us kind of release some control and looking at how we can best leverage expertise that exists out there to create and strengthen this shared economy to help us look at overcoming large obstacles in a little bit of a different way. So I'm just going to show you a 1-minute video and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So hopefully you can hear this.
So what exactly is the collaborative economy? Well, it's a horizontal peer-to-peer economy based on the pooling and sharing of knowledge, services, and goods, where exchanges should be based on fairness, transparency, and goodwill. After all, at a time of economic crisis and massive change, why wouldn't 3 million interconnected human beings enter into direct exchanges with each other, cutting out the expensive and unnecessary middleman? And that's why the beginnings of a new economy are emerging. Car sharing, home sharing, wikis, crowdfunding, skill swaps, and alternative payment systems. Anyway, to make sure these more direct exchanges aren't taken over by a few opportunist companies that don't actually share very much, we'll need to sort out new concepts of ownership and therefore finance. A free internet where your private life really is private, and structures based more closely on solidarity. And while we're on the subject of the sharing economy, which is doubling in size each year, wouldn't it be nice to share the value generated too, by moving towards cooperative models, for example? And, well, that's just about it.
So a short little video, so the emerging collaborative economy. So we've seen a rise in the emerging collaborative economy with companies like Uber and Airbnb, right, in the last few years, who have gained lots of market share and have really left a mark and improved the way that we live. So this economy is mainly based on sharing, right? It's based on sharing and making use of different marketplaces and peer-to-peer networks to deliver some sort of a positive social outcome or create value in the customers that they're reaching to serve ultimately. So in this context, we've seen this sort of collaborative economy lead to various different ownership and collective models. We've seen it lead to a lot of social action, and just generally, we've seen it lead to more, I think, I would argue, more community impact. So the goal here is really to bring together various actors, policymakers, practitioners, academics, community organizations, to help them understand the broader challenges, right, that exists out there, or an unfilled need, a gap of some sort, and then have that create or lead to sort of new economic models that are rooted in social innovation, right? And doing things a little bit differently. And I think this is where we have an opportunity to create a lot more social impact, right? So just a really, really good way of solidifying that process. So bringing that into a typical cycle of what happens when we look at innovation, in this context, social innovation, I would argue these steps are kind of common to any type of innovation with a little bit of a language change depending on where you are. But we want to start with understanding our problems really well. So where do the gaps exist? As opposed to assuming that we know what the problems are, what a social innovation model forces us to do is to actually validate that that is in fact the problem that exists. You are spending a ton of time validating your problem. So this is something that involves going out there to the audience that you're trying to serve, going back to your customers, to your stakeholders and shareholders and saying, have I understood that this is in fact the problem? And is this also the way that you understand the problem? And I think that conversation is really valuable because what happens a lot of cases in my experience is that we haven't actually captured the problem in its entirety, and that there's always something left out. So I think these conversations and spending and investing a lot more time in problem exploration than we otherwise might is essential to sort of creating an outcome that serves the needs of the population that we want, whose lives we're trying to improve ultimately. So problem exploration. Based on learning what and validating what the problem is, we then move on to solutionizing and taking those potential solutions. Mind you, I'm not saying innovation here on purpose, I'm saying solutions, because they may or may not be innovative yet. And we don't know until we take the solutions back to our audience and say, based on what you told me the issue is, what's the extent to which these potential solutions actually help you out, make your life easier, or tackle the issue that you were telling me you're grappling with. So based on what you're learning through that solution back and forth, that quick back and forth process, you're actually engaging in fast, rapid experimentation cycles. So you created something, it's imperfect, but that's okay. You're going back to your audience and saying, is this good? Yes. Why? Great. Why not? How can I improve it? So you're going back and forth, failing fast, and you're failing cheap. You're failing cheap because you're not investing a ton of resources. You're not investing a ton of money making this product, service, or prototype perfect, right? You're spending as much time as you need to on it to fill a need or fill in a gap or respond to a need rather, but not any more time than you actually need to. So that way, when you do fail, and really that's okay because you're going through an experimentation cycle. When you do fail, when you realize that it's not exactly meeting all of the needs of your customer, then you can pivot and adjust without having spent countless time, money, resources, dollars into something that doesn't essentially isn't innovative and doesn't serve a purpose. So at the end of that cycle, you would release what we call a minimum viable product out in the market and see how it does. So it's minimum because it's not perfect, it gets the job done, and there's always room for improvement there. So this is a cycle that has a lot more sub-steps, right? It's an oversimplification, but it does do a decent job in capturing the essential elements that you would consider going through that innovation cycle, regardless of industry. So moving from that into some practical tools of social innovation. So these tools you may or may not have seen. So this is adapted from Strategizer, which is a discipline that's really been defined by Alex Osterwalder. I'm not sure if any of you in the call here have heard of Alex. So it's just one methodology, and I think it's a really good one when we start looking at what that customer experience means and how do we create and design innovations that ultimately meet the needs of our customers and fill in and create value. So what you're seeing here is a value map that describes the feature of a specific value you're trying to create for your customer in a detailed way. So you have product, services, pain relievers, gain creators. Ultimately, the goal is to ensure that your product or service aligns with what your customers' needs are, right? We just talked about that. And the way that you create fit or fill in that need is when your value map meets your customer's profile. So when the right and the left align and speak to each other, okay? So to say it a different way, your goal is to make sure that the products you're creating and the services you're producing actually alleviate pain or obstacles that your audience is facing, and that the gain creators that match, or your gain creators are matching one or more of the jobs that your customers are trying to fulfill, and that the pains and gains are actually responding to one another. So let's break this down into more practical terms. So if you look at the diagram on the far left-hand corner, you'll see these little pie pieces. You'll see that the pains here with a little, with a sad face here. So the pain for me might be a lack of access to an affordable apartment that allows me to live there comfortably with a family of four, right? So a lack of affordable housing and apartment. So when we look at how to create alignment between the left and the right diagram, we might look at the square on the right-hand side where you see a little pill under pain relievers. And so a direct pain reliever to that pain I'm feeling on the left-hand side might be government instituting a foreign investment tax, let's say, that limits the ability of foreign investors to actually purchase apartments and properties in the province or city that I live in, that's in effect causing prices of housing to go up. So that tax may be a direct response to the pain I'm experiencing, and it might be one type of pain reliever. To bring that down into even more practical levels, right? A pain that I might be experiencing is a migraine. I might have headaches. I suffer from headache. The way that headache aligns with the value proposition canvas on the right-hand side is that Advil or Tylenol could be a direct response to that and a very concrete pain reliever. So you're always working on creating that camaraderie and that alignment. When you look at, we talked about pains, when you look at gains. So what are the things that have helped me gain an edge as a customer? And so how do those gains actually relate to specific actions that have led to those gains? So what are the gain creators? What helped realize that gain in the end? And similar to that, we can look at the customer jobs. So what jobs are customers trying to do? Like, what are they trying to obtain? What are they looking to do in their day-to-day? And so how does that align with the products and services that you as a company, as a producer, as an industry are producing out there that you're offering them? So is your offering in effect helping them do their jobs? So this isn't revolutionary, but it is really neat. And I think it forces us to really think about highlighting the customer experience. We have Dan on this call today, and he's a guru in customer experience in Manitoba in the financial services sector. So he's an expert in this. He could talk to you forever about it. But really, I think a lot of the drivers of social innovation and creating awesome, superior products and services that are going to meet the needs of your clients is ultimately rooted in that customer empathy work and that customer profile and that customer experience. So by looking at these two diagrams, anytime you're forced to think about redefining or enhancing your business model or creating some sort of an innovation, it forces you to ask the question of, okay, so how is what I'm putting out there actually going to help me create something that's going to make this person's life easier? And I think that's where the opportunity exists to create something that's truly unique and out of box. Okay, I can talk to you more about this. I can send some of these diagrams to you, but if you want to jot it down, if you're interested in the value proposition canvas and in Strategizer as a discipline, I can send you more resources there if you wanted to just reach out to Caleb and he can connect us. Moving from the practical tools into some models that lend themselves to us using these practical tools, there are a lot of social innovation models. Today, because of time restrictions, I'm going to just go through 3 of them. And I'm not going to do an exhaustive job in summarizing them, but these are really interesting models that we've seen gain traction in North America and Europe in the last few years. And I think that this is where there is a collaborative space to create synergies with all sorts of industry partners to try to create some sort of impact in our communities and essentially support the process of innovation. So I know a lot of provinces and jurisdictions that are on this call today have instituted certain models here that I'm talking about. So I'll go at it at a really sort of broad level, beginning with social impact bonds. So SIBs or social impact bonds are a little bit controversial, right? So it's a non-typical way of funding social services that can lead to financial and service-based social innovations. Not always, but if designed properly, they can. So they've gained global traction in the past 7 to 10 years, I would say. So it's essentially a pay for performance model. So it's government who would traditionally deliver programs and services going out to non-traditional partners, non-traditional funders in the private, non-for-profit and philanthropic sectors to get them all together and ask them to fund an intervention or a social service versus what would happen traditionally, which is government taking that ownership and just funding it on their own. So an example would be high rate of diabetes in northern community amongst Indigenous populations. So that is an example of an issue that government would have traditionally taken ownership of and created programs and services largely in a vacuum, I mean, with some community engagement and leveraging to try to resolve. What this social innovation model or social finance model tries to do is say, okay, cool, we haven't been able to respond to that very well in a vacuum or with these limited partners. Now we're going to go to other actors that haven't traditionally been involved in this and see what they have to say about it. Yes, they help us in a financial way by funding a portion of this intervention, but they're also involved in the design of this program. And that's where there lies an opportunity to create some innovations in a program and a service area as well, in addition to the financial area. So I think it's really interesting and neat. What, a few slides ago, we talked about some pressures that governments are facing with some global unrest and geopolitics and rising cost of living. I think when we look at models like social impact bonds, they do have a really vast opportunity to take some of the financial pressure off government in funding all sorts of interconnected, complex, wicked policy problems by taking some of that pressure off and kind of stepping up. So in that sense, it's really similar to corporate social responsibility. And I think it's really gaining traction in many jurisdictions. Another benefit of it is that it focuses on outcomes. So at the end, if an evaluation shows that a particular intervention within the scope of the social impact bond is positive, government has one or two options. It can either continue running that intervention as a social impact bond, so having more of a channel into non-traditional partners to remain involved, or it can say, great, now you've helped us overcome this issue and it's in a better position, the program is in a better position. Now we're going to actually go ahead and adopt this as a traditional government model and run it the way that we otherwise might have. So a few different options of sort of what happens after a social impact bond completes or is essentially evaluated at the end. So there are about 300 social impact bonds globally right now in various areas in health. We see a lot of them in health, in family and child welfare. We see a lot of them in justice to reduce the rates of recidivism or reoffending rates. I was actually instrumental in creating one of Canada's top 3 social impact bonds in the area of child welfare. The SIB was called Restoring the Sacred Bond, and the purpose was to try to reduce the extremely high rates of Indigenous children in the care of government. So this is an area that government kept spending money in, seeing some benefits certainly, but it was sort of deemed an area that needed a little bit more revitalization and a different way of looking at how to overcome that issue. And so I think the program is in year 3 of its pilot right now. And since then, there have been multiple social impact bonds added around the environment and many other hot topics and issues of the day. So those are SIBs. We move on to outcomes purchasing next. So very similar to social impact bond, and it's similar in the sense that you're really relying heavily on that contingent of co-creation, and you're really relying on the expertise that exists outside of one sector, in this case outside of government, and you're leveraging the subject matter expertise that exists in your community. And so what happens is essentially the community owns the response to various social ills or issues, and they figure out a way to respond to those obstacles by creating an intervention. And it could be in any area. And what government does is it goes out to the communities and says, I'm going to purchase this outcome because it aligns with the problem that I'm experiencing. So instead of government defining that process itself and then soliciting help from the community, which is a more traditional way of looking at overcoming problems, the government is more hands-off and says, you figure out what the issues are and you figure out a recipe for overcoming them, and I'll let you know and I'll purchase those outcomes. So then funding is provided based on the purchasing on the strongest intervention. And at the end, what you have is a social return on investment, which is used to leverage I think whether or not, the program did what it was supposed to do, or whether or not a certain effect or outcome is ultimately purchased at the end. And it's very merit-based. So you see outcomes purchasing and social impact bond models gain a lot of traction and popularity in small conservative governments and in conservative political environments that I think tend to often be more partial to that devolution model and looking to outside expertise to help with overcoming a wicked policy problem. So a lot of outcomes purchasing models that we've seen in Canada, certainly in the last 3 to 4 years. Last but not least, housing investment corporations. So these are corporations created to fix a problem. In this case, housing and homelessness, which, as I've said a few slides ago, remains a really, really fundamental challenge here for Canada in certain pockets of the country. So Housing Investment Corporation addresses barriers to affordable housing. It builds capacity amongst affordable housing providers to allow them to fill in the gap around a lack of affordability. So what happens is the corporation, so this Housing Investment Corporation, takes stock of all of the affordable housing needs that exist in a country or a region. It quantifies those needs. So it could say, based on my scan, there's about a $50 billion gap or need for affordable housing in Canada. Example, okay? It then takes that quantified need and it goes to the capital markets and it lends that $50 million, it borrows rather that money from the capital markets. It takes it and it re-lends it back to affordable housing providers that are looking to build affordable housing by allowing them the benefit of long-term money at lower rates than they would otherwise have gotten from traditional lending institutions such as banks. So it says to them, here, borrow from this pool of money that we borrowed from the capital markets, and I'll give you access to 1.5 to 2.5% 30-year money, as opposed to 10-year terms, which is more common with financial or traditional financial institutions, and at much higher rates of 5 to 6% when you're lending within that broad scope. So it's really attractive for affordable housing providers because of many reasons. It allows them access to money very fast without that administrative burden, without jumping through the hoops of traditional lending institutions. It gives them way longer term money, right, at way more favorable terms. And it allows them to do what they're there to do, which is fill in the gap and create more affordable housing units in Canada. And it's innovative because it's a different way of looking at filling in the gap. And so I was one of 3 partners in Canada that created this Housing Investment Corporation along with 2 other provinces. And I'm happy to report that it's still gained and is continuing to gain a lot of traction because it's rooted within the concept of sustainability and empowering housing providers, i.e. the community, the experts that do what they do best, to do their part and to actually build systems that support the most vulnerable people, in this case, individuals seeking affordable housing and needing shelter, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples where housing investment corporations really taken off. One is in the province of Alberta. So that's kind of like a state equivalent for our American friends. Within Edmonton Capital Region Housing Project. So that project was able, through this model, to obtain $10 million worth of funding and totally revitalize a very depressed area of Edmonton in the province of Alberta. And we've seen many, many more social benefits take off as a result of this project, because we know that housing isn't an island. A lot of other social indicators are so profoundly linked and interconnected to that affordability of housing. Also in Vancouver, if any of you are familiar with Vancouver in the province of British Columbia, you'll know that the province has struggled for years with affordable housing and just a general lack of housing stock. So through Housing Investment Corporation, through this model that I've just kind of explained, affordable housing providers have been able to really create some impact through a project called the Vancouver Community Land Trust. So you can look that up if you're interested in more details, that created a lot more impact in a region that was otherwise out of reach for a lot of Vancouverites and people living in that general area. So this is by no means a full exhaustive list of social innovation models. They're just a few models that I myself personally have been involved in, and they're models that I've seen gain profound traction in this country. And I know, for instance, social impact bonds have gained a lot of popularity, not just in Canada, but in the US and many, many countries abroad. And I don't suspect that any of these will stop. I think they'll start popping up more and more, and we'll start to see more of these in the coming years, just because the traditional system that we have in place right now, with government being responsible for responding to all of this, is just not sustainable, right? So we'll move on. Okay. So before you start innovating, right, we talked about practical tools, we talked about some theoretical models that support those tools. Before you begin, you want to start thinking about how best to answer these 10 questions. So if you're a person that says, you know what, those tools that you shared are things that I can start incorporating and doing in my day-to-day job after I finish with this webinar, I will say all the power to you. Please do it. How can I support you? Before you do that, you'll want to think about how to answer this, and you'll want to have good answers to this before you go on. Because if you don't know how to answer this, I think that the solutions you're trying to strengthen and ultimately the innovations you're trying to create will be at risk of failure, right? So number one, you want to name your innovation. What is your innovation doing? The name should be indicative of the benefit that you're trying to create. So this seems trivial, maybe a little bit vague and unimportant, but it does ultimately always come back to this. So you want this to be very, very intuitive. You don't have to have it right off the hop, but it is something that you need to define fairly early on. Number two, what is the meaningful uniqueness of your innovation? So meaningful uniqueness is, you know, a catchphrase that is borrowed from the discipline of innovation engineering from our folks at Envision Edge. So what this means is the meaningful part is like, how does your innovation or solution enhance the life of the customer or the service seeker that you're trying to serve? So how does it create value in his or her or their lives? And furthermore, how is it unique? So how does it do that? How does it provide that value in a way that hasn't really been responded to in the market already? So what's meaningful about it? How does it fill in a gap? And how has that gap not been invented by somebody already out there, right? So meaningful uniqueness, really, really important when we start looking at value added and a return on investment. Number three, customers. You got to know who your customers are. And this could be one customer base, it could be many. Who are they? Define them, and then also identify how they benefit from this invention or from this meaningfully unique solution that you're putting out there. For problem. So what problem does the innovation address? So what's the gap that it's filling? Is it a product that you're offering that doesn't exist out there that needs to exist? Is it a social service? Is it an intervention? Is it as simple as a training program that's really needed that you're creating value by putting out there? Is it a method? You have to know what you're putting out there adds value and what problem it's solving. And it's not just that you have to know what it is, you have to be able to articulate that back. It's almost like, how do you do that in a 30-second pitch if somebody was to ask you how you're creating that value? Related to that is the benefit promise in number 5. So this is really about quantifying the benefit that your invention or innovation or solution is providing. So what is it that, you know, it is helping overcome? Is it going to save the company an X amount of millions of dollars down the road by having this new invention in place? By creating this product, is it really saving the insurance company money down the road by keeping customers with the company as opposed to driving them away and having them seek that service from a competitor or somebody else? So you want to quantify that. You want to do some research and have some numbers attached to that promise. Number 6 is proof. So what is the innovation? And what is being done differently? So you have to really, really go back to that meaningful uniqueness conversation in number 2 and look at where's the proof that what you're putting out there is actually creating a different approach, an out-of-box approach to something that's never been done. And you want to do that just by doing some basic research and contextualizing that information. So number 7, you know, back to that customer centricity discussion that we talked about earlier on, is what's the customer price and why is it a good value? So if you're creating a pair of ergonomic speakers and you're charging 30% more for them than what you see amongst your competitors out there, that might be okay, but it's your job to be able to articulate why that's a good value. So paying $130 for these ergonomic sneakers compared to $100 that you see out there, maybe, and it is a good value when you consider X, Y, and Z. So really thinking about that and painting a story, creating a story to support your vision and your meaningfully unique solution that you're putting out there. Number 8 is the passion. You have to show what the passion behind your invention is. So this solution is important because, and this is really your opportunity to tie it into a global context. So, you know, this solution is really awesome because it ties into the global sustainability goals, or it helps take some of the pressure off of the conflict that we're experiencing overseas right now. Like, so you want to create a little bit of an emotional attachment and tie in various global elements, if you can, to what you're talking about and to what you're creating, if the opportunity arises, because I think that's such an important part of getting support for your idea, right? You want to tell a story. Number 9 and 10 are all about, you know, risk and risk mitigation. So we call them death threats. If you're in the area of health, and when you're talking about death threats and using that synonymously with obstacles, maybe you want to try to stay away from that, because it can be a charged term, because the worst thing that can happen is an actual death, right? But if you're in production or in a parallel industry, death threat might be more appropriate, or something that you might want to use. So this is about identifying the risks that are most likely to end up harming your invention, your solution, or your innovation. So what about this will fracture what you're putting out there? And so what are those risks? And you're ranking those risks, and then you're creating mitigation strategies to help you overcome them. I will say that if you're unable to overcome your top 2 or 3 death threats or your risks, there's absolutely no sense in moving down that list and trying to figure out ways of overcoming risk or death threat 4, 5, or 6. Because if you're failing with your top risk and you don't have a strategy to overcome that and to solutionize a path forward, then it won't matter that you have a solution to those risks that are deemed lesser in scope or not as profound, right? So you want to develop and think about what's going to create this to sort of crumble, what's gonna cause us to die ultimately, right? Pardon my colloquialism. And then how can I avoid that? And so you would go through some mitigation cycles, through some plan, do, study, act cycles, if we've got any Lean Six Sigma people on the call, and until you've sort of overcome all of those threats. Once you can answer these 10 questions, you don't want to do this in a vacuum. If you're working with a community of individuals around a solution or a product or an invention, you want to make sure that you're answering these together with them, and that you that you record them somewhere, whether it's in a card or on a piece of paper. But it's got to be a democratic process. So that way, when everybody runs off and takes the solutions to the next level and prototypes and goes through those experimentation cycles that we talked about, it's often common to lose sight with your original intent. If this is captured somewhere and if everybody has access to it, you can always keep coming back to this to level set and keep you grounded and keep you on the same track. So I think this is really important to do, and to use this sort of almost like as a part of your strategy that you keep continuously coming back to. So I will leave you with this before we get into a bit of a dialogue and a Q&A. This is a popular one. You've probably seen this before, but Henry Ford said that if I had asked people what they wanted when he was inventing Ford vehicles, a car, they would have said faster horses, right? If I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And I think this is so simple but powerful. What it means is that we don't always have the solutions to everything. And I know that we place so much onus on customer experience and the voice of that customer, which is so integral to any innovation or service or product that we're delivering. But we also have to keep in mind that they don't always know what they want. And as entrepreneurs, right, as innovators, our job is to work and bring all of those partners around the table to try to help them reach some sort of a solution or an outcome or idea, and test an idea that may not have existed there with them before. So you would do that by going through various exercises and really pushing them to think beyond those limits and boundaries until they've added to something that they have surprised themselves with ultimately, right? So we don't always know what the formula is, but we can get there together by asking thought-provoking questions and pushing people to think about overcoming fundamental policy issues and obstacles in non-traditional ways, right? So this one I always have in my office and I look to, and it's always been such a source of inspiration. So That is all I'll say for now. I think I'm just going to park it right here. I'm not sure where we're at with time, but I just, I want to hear from you and what your experience has been, and to see if you have any questions or clarifications on any of the stuff that we've talked about here today.
And feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question out loud or make a comment out loud. Or if you aren't comfortable speaking out loud, feel free dropping it in the chat and we'll read it.
So can I trust you then, Caleb, with a chat? I guess I can monitor it here too.
Absolutely.
Will the presentation slides be available? Somebody's asking.
If you share them with me, I will share them with the everyone who sent it.
Okay, so what I'll do is I'll post them on my website. I'll give you the link, Caleb, and you can just disseminate to the team, and you can find them there. Awesome.
Anybody with any questions or comments?
It's Dan here. Just a comment just back to your slide there, Sandra, regarding point number 7 on price. I think something that's worth throwing out there is for brands to consider their relative market positioning and how they in turn position price, because what I've seen in my past working life is brands who believe that they are presenting a premium product and price it as such, but the market actually views them as a more budget level brand, and that causes confusion because customers look at it and go, this doesn't make any sense relative to how I understand your brand, your brand proper brand value.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that. And as you're talking, I'm reminded of that customer centricity, right? That customer experience dialogue that we talked about when I was showing some of those practical tools. I'm just trying to get to them, right? Because you may think that what you're putting out there fills a need, and that you understand the issue and how to resolve it based on your observations. But I think the ultimate test on that, and the ultimate knocking us on our butts experience, will really come out once you actually test that. So that's why that rapid experimentation cycle is so important when we look at product and service innovations, because whatever you're putting out there is ultimately being vetted by your customers, and they are the knowledge holders and the true sayers, right? So I may think what I'm putting out there is extremely superior. It's a top brand. There's there's a need for it, but you're always level setting by putting that out there and letting them be the validators of what you're creating, right? Because they're the ultimate reason for you existing and for what your product is trying to do. So I think when we look at that customer map, and you'll see that when we send the PowerPoint, it helps drive home that alignment cycle. So you're looking at how are the jobs to be done, and how are the pains and obstacles that my customers are experiencing actually being addressed by the service? Is there a need? So that's why we want to talk about asking the questions, those 10 questions, and going through those experimentation cycles and pivoting and learning really early on, as opposed to making assumptions and then learning the hard way down the road once you've invested millions of dollars, once you've invested critical, crucial human resources into something that may not actually perform as well as you have hoped. And that's the beauty of innovation, not just social innovation, but that's the beauty of innovation processes generally, is that they're really rooted in that failing fast and failing cheap mentality. So thanks for raising that.
Yeah, if I could just add to that too, I think in terms of trying to have fast experimentation cycles, if you build customer panels, it really helps to mitigate the risk, because then you're only releasing the product to a limited number of folks, so you can really test it out sort of in that microcosm before you go to market. So if there are significant challenges with the product, you can catch them earlier rather than roll it out and then wait for you to get lit up on social media and elsewhere, because that's how things work these days. So no, it's a good perspective on how to build stuff like this out.
So Dan is our customer experience guru, and I've had the distinct pleasure of working with Dan in the financial services sector when I was spearheading innovation in the Innovation Lab, and he was leading the customer experience segment. And of course, as we know, and we talked about this today, the two are so intricately linked. So these customer panels, Dan, is this something that put the question right back to you. Is this something that sort of ultimately absolutely always goes hand in hand in product and service development? And do we see it across many organizations? Or is this something that's still very raw and not quite fully baked, and is something that organizations are still trying to sort of build out? I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, it really depends on the industry vertical you're in. I mean, if you're tech or SaaS based, for example, I mean, I think those cycles naturally gravitate toward that. Whereas in other industries, including say in financial services, it's coming around. It's it's a vertical that's sort of been viewed technologically as a dinosaur in terms of innovating, understanding what product means to today's clients. But it's really important to kind of understand what industry you're talking about before you then look for the behaviors. So I'd say there's some variability there depending on what market you're talking about or what industry.
Awesome.
Any more questions or comments? Well, if not, I will be uploading this video to YouTube and distributing it to everyone who signed up so you can review or share. And we'll be sharing you a link to Sandra's website that's going to have those slides. Sandra, thank you so much for this presentation. We really appreciate it. I know everyone who's on here appreciate it. And we look forward to connecting and collaborating with you and everyone else on the call again soon.
Thank you so much. And Caleb, if there are any questions from anybody offline once we finish that you wanted to disseminate to me, I will be happy to answer those one-off as well, if there's anything that comes up. And thank you so much for everybody that attended. And I always love talking about this. So if anybody wants to have a side dialogue or chat about any of what we talked about today around those models or practical tools or resources, please reach out.
Awesome. Everyone have the great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.